You're listening to All Kinds of Catholic with me, Teresa Alessandro. My conversations with different Catholics will give you glimpses into some of the ways we're living our faith today. Pope Leo, quoting St. Augustine, reminds us, "Let us live well, and the times will be good. We are the times." I hope you feel encouraged and affirmed, and sometimes challenged, as I am in these conversations. Join our podcast community, get news and background information about the conversations, and share your thoughts if you want to. You can get the newsletter and each episode straight to your inbox by going to allkindsofcatholic.substack.com and clicking on subscribe. It's free. That web address is in the episode notes too, and I'd love you to draw closer to our community. Thank you. This week, listeners, you're just hearing part one of my conversation with Roy Peachey, because the conversation is so wide-ranging that I've split it into two parts. If you want to find out more about Roy's work, which we're going to be talking about in this conversation and in part two, there's a link in the episode notes to Roy's website. Let's get into today's conversation. Thanks for joining the episode today, everyone. I'm being joined by Roy today. We've got quite a lot to talk about, so let's see where the Holy Spirit takes us in this conversation. Thanks for joining, Roy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So first of all, if we might start, in some ways it's at the beginning, and in some ways maybe not at the beginning, because you're not someone who's been a Catholic since you were a little tiny baby. So maybe you tell us about the beginning of you becoming a Catholic then. What happened there?
I grew up in a vaguely Anglican environment. I was christened, as many people were, really for mainly social reasons, I guess. I went to the local Anglican primary school, but my parents weren't churchgoers. Although I did join the Anglican church choir because a friend of mine invited me along. So I grew up attending Anglican services. So I can't really think of a time when I didn't believe in God. But I only really took it seriously at university. And at university, I threw myself into the Christian Union, and I was the college rep, and I went on missions and did the whole evangelical thing. After university, I went and worked for a night shelter in Leeds, and it was a really tough year. I was attacked quite a lot.
Oh.
I had a lot of growing up to do. It really shook me in all sorts of ways. It shook my faith. It shook my self-confidence, I guess. So after that, I really drifted away from the church. I stopped going to church regularly. I would go every now and again, but I didn't really know what I thought anymore. And then eventually I got a job in a Catholic school, and we went off to Mass for Holy Days of Obligation. And I can't say that made much of an impression on me, to be honest, but what did make an impression on me was the new Catholic friends I was making. And many of them were very impressive, and I really got to like them a lot. One of them I then became engaged to. So my fiancée, as she then was, my wife as she now is, was very good and didn't really put any pressure on me. She was very gentle with me. But one weekend, she suggested that we would perhaps go away for the weekend. We'd go up to Yorkshire and meet some friends of hers, which I thought was a great idea. It was only as we got closer to this trip that I realized that these friends of hers were Benedictine monks, and the place she was taking me was Ampleforth Abbey.
Okay.
I'd never met a monk before in my life. I had no idea about monasticism. This was all completely new to me. But the monks were incredibly welcoming. Benedictine hospitality is fantastic. The food at Ampleforth is very, very good. I went for a very long walk over the North York moors with one of the monks, Father Chad, who's a wonderful man. And I just threw all my Protestant objections at him, every single one. The role of Our Lady, place of the Pope, every possible objection going all the way back to Luther. And he just very calmly dealt with each one of them. So I went away and thought about it. And secretly, I didn't actually tell my fiancée what I was doing. I went and got instruction from the local parish priest, who was, again, very patient with me. He was actually an Anglican convert, which probably helped at that stage of my life. Then, shortly before we were married, I crossed the Tiber very reluctantly, I have to say. I remember asking this priest, what's the bare minimum I have to sign up for? What's the bare minimum I have to believe before I can become a Catholic? And I saw it at that stage as just another step in the journey, nothing too world shattering. But once I was in, and once I was going to Mass every week, it was the time I converted just in the last months, really, of Pope John Paul II. And I was very, very moved by his holy death. And then the early years of Pope Benedict XVI, and I read a lot. I read a lot of what Pope Benedict wrote in particular, and he writes so beautifully, so clearly. That shaped me, began to shape me intellectually. All of my old Protestant objections, even the ones that were still kind of lingering slightly in the background, just fell away. Yeah, I was in and very happy to be in.
Roy, that's a great story. There's some points at which, I can see connections with things other people have said about their journey into the church and some things that are unique to you. That's really interesting. And very honest about the somewhat brutal experience of working in a night shelter. I think sometimes if you haven't been in an environment like that, we can feel very deeply that we want to support people who are homeless. We want them to have, a good experience where we can help, and that is right and good. But actually on the front line there, it can be not quite as shiny and warm as you were hoping, I guess. People who are in distressing situations aren't necessarily coping well themselves. That can come out in fractious relationships with others, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. I think I was very young and I was still very naive, I think. And I went in with very good intentions, but I had very little experience of the world. The night shelter I was working for was an emergency night shelter. So we basically dealt with the rough sleepers who nobody else would have. So we had quite a lot of chronic alcoholics, some drug addicts, at least a couple of people who'd done time for manslaughter. They were a pretty rough bunch. I mean, some wonderful, wonderful people there. I really loved getting to know these men. And I'm really glad I did that year. I certainly grew up a lot. But there was always this lingering sense of threat. I always went to work in the evening thinking, am I going to be hit this evening? And after a while, that does wear you down a little.
Yeah, and I always feel for people whose lives have led them into situations where they need to use those kind of places to sleep. I bet a lot of them are really frightened too about having to go there and try and get through the night.
Yeah, exactly. And lots of people had been in this situation for a long time, for many, many years. But you came across some people, we probably came across it slightly less than others, but we came across some people who clearly this was new to them or relatively new to them. And that was very, very tough to see.
Yeah.
I mean, naturally, we didn't probe too much, and the men themselves didn't want to talk too much about their own past. But just occasionally, you'd get some of the stories, and people came from very ordinary backgrounds, the sort of backgrounds that you and I probably have, and yet for various reasons, lots of mental health issues. Actually, that was another big concern. They ended up in this inconceivable situation. So there was a lot of people who just struggling to get through every day. And some of them became angry, and that's completely understandable.
Thank you. That's a bit of an aside, but I think those are the experiences that we bring with us through our lives, and our faith is part of that too. So, you married a Catholic. We had another guest recently. He married the first Catholic he met. Perhaps you had met a few more before reaching that point, but still. You then began to work in Catholic schools and found good friendships there. That's really interesting. And again, there's lots of people who have talked about coming to the church, having met people that have impressed them. Not everyone's lucky enough to go for a long walk with a Benedictine monk, but I'm sure most people would find that pretty impressive when they can respond to your questions so thoroughly and calmly, I think you said.
It wasn't just the professionals, as it were. It wasn't just the monks. My sponsor, when I became a Catholic, was the maths teacher at the school I was working at the time. And she was just a lovely, bubbly person. And I remember chatting to her at one point. The question of Catholic guilt came up, and she just said, "Well, just look around. Look at the Catholics here. Do they all look guilty?" And so I thought, no, none of them are guilty at all. They're kind of all very together people. It was really a case of shedding quite a lot of the stereotypes, some of the myths that you unconsciously take on, or I had unconsciously taken on anyway. So there were lots and lots of good people, most of whom I had absolutely no conversations about theology with whatsoever, but a combination of doing my own reading and chatting to Father Chad, that just got me far enough to then enable me to see that actually I hadn't really considered the claims of the church properly at all before. I'd studied history at university. I'd really focused on the Reformation, actually, that being a big area of study for me, but I'd never really taken the claims, the Catholic claims, seriously at all. So it was the people, it was the warmth, it was the friendship that really made the difference for me.
Lovely. I feel really delighted to hear someone's experience like that. And at the same time, I feel a little frisson of, you could meet somebody. There's plenty of Catholic people who, on a bad day, they might not give such a good witness. Thank goodness that didn't happen. But I suppose if you're meeting lots of people who are, and sometimes just being a human being having a bad day is not necessarily going to put someone off becoming a Catholic, because that's just part of everybody's experience, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I guess I feel a sense of responsibility when I hear from people who have been drawn further on their journey into the church from meeting Catholic people. I feel that kind of responsibility in my core, that you never know who you might be interacting with, who you can give a good impression of what it is to be a Catholic too.
Yes, and even as I'm saying this now, I'm now thinking, what sort of impression am I giving? Having had this very positive experience myself, I hope I'm giving at least some of that to others. But we all have bad days, and we all look back and think, "Oh my goodness, I didn't get that right." But God's bigger than that.
Exactly.
We only need to look at the mistakes of King David, St. Paul, St. Peter. None of them got it right all the time, and yet look what they achieved.
Exactly. Yes. Get back on the horse. I slightly veered us off there towards some Catholic guilt of my own, I think. Okay. I was looking at your website. You're somebody who seems very high achieving, who's worked in many different areas and been very productive in a range of different areas. I feel slightly overawed. So there's your teaching work, but also there's your writing. I wonder if you'd tell us a bit about your writing and how faith has been part of that.
Yeah, I've always been a secret scribbler. My wife is incredibly tolerant, so book after book was being written and not getting published and going into a dusty drawer somewhere, but she let me carry on. So that was great. And I think actually once I had been a Catholic for a few years, I started to think, actually, I need to work out how this applies to every aspect of my life. So in particular, I started really by thinking through, what's it mean to be a Catholic teacher? What does this mean? How do I convey this through my English lessons? I was primarily teaching English. So I changed school at one point, and then I started a blog initially, and then I started writing a book about Catholic education, really for my own benefit as much as anything else. But that was then published, which was fantastic. And then that really opened the door to all sorts of other books. So I had a novel published soon after that, a book about Catholic literature. And then I've now written a number of non-fiction books, so about history, about literature, about education, books for children, book about the saints, some fiction for children, and then various books for adults as well. Just had a new novel come out for adults. Time of recording, I'm about to bring out a new novel for children. Hopefully, by the time this is broadcast, that will have hit the shelves as well. A lot of the time, I start writing a book thinking, I would like an answer to this question, or I wish there were a book about this and I can't find it.
Right.
Therefore, thinking, well, I hope this will then be helpful for other people too. I'm not J.K. Rowling here. I'm not.
Well, it sounds a bit like it to me. It's hard to imagine somebody who wrote books that ended up in the drawer not published when I can see how many books you have had published. It looks impressive to me anyway. And also it seems impressive to write both fiction and non-fiction. Again, that tells me that you're somebody who can do a lot of different things. You have a lot of different skills, because they're not quite the same thing, are they?
No, they're not the same thing. Although there are links. I mean, it's good to write non-fiction books that are actually readable, which is not always the case. I've always resisted all the way through being pinned down to one area of interest. I remember going to university actually, and I was, first time round anyway, I was studying history. And after a few weeks, the librarian in the college said, oh, we couldn't work out what you were studying, because I was getting out books about poetry. I was getting books of psychology out, probably got a few history books out as well. I suppose part of me would have thrived in the American system where you study a whole range of different subjects and then very gradually narrow down, whereas the English system really forces you into studying one or possibly two subjects. I've really enjoyed writing across a range of different subjects. I love writing fiction. It's so enjoyable. Being creative, I think, is, to bring it back to your original question, how this ties in with Catholicism. I think Tolkien said we are sub-creators. One reason we create is because we are made in the image of the creator God. And I love that idea that when we are creating on a much lesser level, we are doing something that is in the image of God himself, who is a creator. And then in terms of the content, I've covered questions that are of interest to mainly to Catholic families, I suppose. As a Catholic parent, I was really working through what it meant to bring up our children and to educate them. A lot of it has been about me trying to work it out for myself. And then off the back of that, I've been able to help various other groups and hopefully readers of the books as well.
Stepping outside the conversation, listeners, I want to build the sustainability of this podcast mission. And if you can contribute to this work of lifting up the voices of ordinary Catholics, please consider a paid subscription. Go to our Substack site to do that. But if not, all our content remains free, and I'm glad these conversations are here for you. Let's get back to this one. Yeah, I like that, Roy. That idea of being creative in the image of God. That's really helpful because that does bring together all the things that I'm seeing about you and the things you can do. It's all about just being creative, like you say, as God himself is in our own tiny way. So that draws it together really well. I'm conscious myself sometimes of creativity and things that I do that can be quite different from each other, but are all creative. And I hadn't thought about making that connection to being made in the image of God. I'm pleased with that. Thanks. Tell us about the book then that is just hitting the shelves. Maybe you'd share a little bit about that. Is faith in there, or is it alluded to, or are there values in there that we might recognise? Might Catholic people be reading it and think this author might be a Catholic? Or is it very different? Tell us a bit about the behind the story.
The book's called The Garden of Perfect Clarity. It's a novel that starts in England. A little boy growing up in England, for various reasons, he leaves home and ends up traveling to China, grows up in China and effectively becomes Chinese. It takes history seriously, but it's not quite a conventional historical novel because it starts in what looks like the 18th century and it finishes in what looks like the 20th century, but it's still the same boy's life, or now grown up to be an adult. So I'm playing around with ideas of time and I'm playing around with ideas of history. It's really set in the aftermath of the Jesuit missions to China. The Jesuits, as many people might know, were hugely influential in China, and they went to China to try and convert the emperor, but also to try and convert ordinary Chinese people, which they did. They managed to convert many, many thousands of Chinese people. They never managed to convert the emperor. And in the end, the Chinese mission was brought to a juddering halt. After they were expelled from China, what happened next? That I found really intriguing because the Christians didn't disappear. They certainly had a tougher time than they'd had before. Other religious orders, the Franciscans and others, were still in China. But there was a sense in which, certainly at the Chinese court, there were all these Christian ideas and Christian symbols that were still there, but gradually being forgotten. So in a way, it was a post-Christian world, or it felt like a post-Christian world. It seems to me that we are living in a very similar sort of environment today, that we can say we're still living in a Christian country, but in many ways, we're very much living in a post-Christian country. And many, many people now have no familiarity whatsoever with the basic ideas of the faith, certainly with the basic symbols of the faith. The book is all narrated from the perspective of this young lad as he grows up. And he's on the outside. He has no knowledge of the faith, but he learns Chinese from a Chinese priest, but then the two of them are separated. So he's got a kind of compass there. He has some sort of dim awareness, but then he goes off in his own way and lots of terrible things happen to him and he does some pretty terrible things as well. So it's really a journey that he goes on. I don't want to spoil the ending in case anybody wants to read it, but he moves towards a different position. Now, he never becomes a Catholic. I didn't want to write crude Catholic propaganda.
Yep.
but there is a story there underlying the obvious story. So my aim really was to write a novel that could be read by all sorts of different audiences. If people are not coming from a position of faith, then I hoped it would appeal to them absolutely as a story, first and foremost, but that also it would start to raise some of these questions. It would be a way of beginning to baptize the imagination, perhaps. And then for Catholics who would understand some of the symbolism that's in the book, some of the ideas that are clearly floating around, then they'd be able to read it in a different way.
Listeners, at the end of this episode, I invited Roy to read some of his work for us, so keep listening for that. And at the end of part 2 of this conversation, coming up in a couple of weeks, Roy will read some more of his work then too.
If I can slightly digress, I've just completed my PhD in theology and literature, and I've focused on 20th century authors. And it strikes me that lots of Catholic authors in the 20th century are doing that. They're writing with two different audiences in mind. They're both appealing to the wider audience. Evelyn Waugh does this, for example. He's writing for a very wide readership. He's clearly a skilled novelist. And yet there is that clearly very Catholic element to his works as well, which take on a deeper resonance if you share his faith. You're constantly trying to walk a fine line as a novelist, and certainly as a Christian or Catholic novelist, because propaganda is terrible. You don't want to just beat people over the head with doctrine in a novel. It's just it's not going to work. So the story needs to drive everything. But nonetheless, there is also, I think, a duty to use our God-given imaginations well. So it's holding those two things in tension.
That is really interesting. We've not had guests talk so much about literature before, and there's a lot there that's very rich. I think we spoke before recording about people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who were some of those 20th century authors, I guess, that you're referring to there, and Ruma Godden. I did not know Ruma Godden was a Catholic until I was speaking to you, so I'm grateful for that news. And I think there's some resonance too with, when we were speaking about Catholic friends that you met, who you didn't necessarily talk to about theology, but nevertheless, there's something about their lives that impressed you, or the way they live their lives that impress you, or about their warmth. There's something about a book that's done well that has those values in it of our faith, but aren't a discussion about theology, aren't, like you say, propaganda, but that can touch people and reach them maybe at a spiritual level. There's some similarity there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Ruma Godden, I think, is a wonderful writer. Some of her books, she explicitly deals with Catholic matters. She writes about the debates over the liturgy, for example, in the 1970s, 60s and 70s in this House of Brede. But in other books, you wouldn't know that she was a Catholic at all because she doesn't address those questions explicitly. In a sense, you've got her Catholic novels and her non-Catholic novels, although I think that's a false distinction. But then if you look at Tolkien, Tolkien's really interesting. But if you look at The Lord of the Rings, he famously said that when he was revising it, he took out all explicit references to religion. And yet he saw this as deeply Catholic work. So he clearly saw that his way of being a Catholic writer was to do something that was very, very different from Ruma Godden or Evelyn Waugh or many other explicitly Catholic writers. And through the story, he does it in all sorts of ways, that very deep faith that he had shines through. And I think The Lord of the Rings, clearly it's had a massive impact on thousands and thousands of people. And some people perhaps still would be surprised to know that he was a Catholic. But I think some people have probably found their way into the church through Tolkien's works, actually. He's a very, very subtle writer. I think a much more subtle writer than he's sometimes given credit for.
Among people listening, I'm sure plenty of you are fans of some of the authors Roy has mentioned there. So listeners, this is the part where Roy's going to read some of his work for us.
So I'll read you a little bit from near the start of The Garden of Perfect Clarity. The context of this passage is the narrator is looking back from the very end of his life to near the beginning of his life. He had a very painful loss. He's looking back at that moment with great pain. But it also opened up for him this journey to the East, which he would never otherwise have gone on. So I'll just read a little bit where he recalls some of these memories and just introduces us to his early time in China.
Okay.
I remember nothing of my mother but her stories. and the sudden pain she inflicted on me the day we were parted. Try as I might, I can neither picture her face nor feel her warmth. Deep as my longing is, she has slipped from me as smoothly as a ship from its moorings. But her stories remain. Boy floating downstream on an upturned shield. A bear living alone in a cave. A great sea creature wrestling with a hero from the north. Story after story tumbles from the past. They are fine threads onto which I hang with all the determination of one lost in the present. They are the means by which I thought I should be saved, and the snares that trapped me in my path. I let my memories swirl about me before pulling myself to my feet and searching for the witch hazel broom. It was time to sweep out the dark rooms of memory and to recover the places I had lost. I started to clear the long wooden surfaces. As I cleaned, I began to see once more with a clarity.
So listeners, that's just a tiny part of Roy's latest novel for adults, The Garden of Perfect Clarity. And if you're interested in his writing for children, he's going to read an excerpt of his latest children's book at the end of the Part 2 episode. We're going to pause this conversation here then, listeners. Part 2 comes out on the 26th of August. I hope you're enjoying so far hearing about Roy's journey to becoming a Catholic, how he's using his gifts in writing, in teaching, and next time we'll hear about some work he's doing with Mary's Meals and about homeschooling, which Roy has been involved in for many years, and also about the prayers and scripture that support Roy in his own faith. So lots more to come next time. Thanks so much for joining me on All Kinds of Catholic this time. I hope today's conversation has resonated with you. A new episode is released each Wednesday, and you can follow All Kinds of Catholic on the usual podcast platforms. Rate and review to help others find it. You can also follow us on social media at Kinds of Catholic. And remember, if you connect with us on Substack, you can comment on episodes and share your thoughts and be part of the dialogue there. Until the next time.